thanks to the Lewis and Clark Library, and thanks to everyone in the audience for coming to hear me talk about my book this evening. So as Suzanne mentioned, my book is called This Land of Snow, A Journey Across the North in Winter. And most basically, it is the kind of a chronicle of an entire winter I spent living outside and traveling across northwestern Canada. And I was on cross-country skis, mainly just because I think that that's the best way to move across a snowy winter landscape. But the book is more than, I hope that it's more than just an adrenaline-driven adventure story. I've read lots of those kinds of stories, and you know, they're interesting, but I find that they get a bit repetitive after a while. So I wanted to write a story that was that could appeal to people who are not just interested in skiing, people who are armchair travelers, armchair adventurers. And also there's a bit of personal stuff in the book, you might say. I wanted to set the story of this journey on skis in the context of my own life, because it seemed to have some importance, you know, that kind of transcended itself, let's say. And also I wanted to talk a bit about the place I was going through, to talk about winter as a season, and about the relationship that we human beings have to landscapes, and specifically how we move across them. And so I tried to kind of package all these things together into a cohesive whole, and I hope that I succeeded. So what I'd like to do this evening is first talk a little bit about the background of the journey that's at the heart of the book, how and why it occurred to me to do something like this, and then kind of take you along the trail with me and stop at 2 or 3 points to read some passages from the book, just to give you a taste of how it reads. And in order to do this, I'm going to just jump over to screen share right away, because I've got some pictures to accompany my words, which I think will make them more interesting. So bear with me for just a second. Here we go. So we should be on the full screen view of my slideshow. If we're not, put a note in the chat, but I think this is okay. So one of the first, oh, just a minute here. I need to go back. Bear with me. It's not. I think I need to enter PowerPoint, and then, okay, this should work now. Okay. So one of the first questions I had to deal with when I sat down to actually start writing a book about this experience was, where do I start telling the story? I mentioned that I didn't want it to just be a story about an adventure, and so I didn't want to start, you know, the moment my feet hit the ground. So I thought about it a bit, and I tell some stories about my childhood and things like that. But one of my starting points, and this is a story I tell near the beginning of the book, is with the guy you see on your screen right now. Now his name is Tony Matt. And Tony Matt was an Austrian. He was a ski racer in Austria in the 1930s, pretty well known at the time. But in 1938, when the Germans annexed Austria, he received an invitation from an acquaintance of his, whose name was Hannes Schneider. Hannes Schneider was a well-known ski instructor and exponent of alpine skiing as opposed to Nordic skiing in Europe. But he was an enemy of the Nazis, and so he decided to flee, and he had an opportunity to come, of all places, to New Hampshire, in the town of North Conway, New Hampshire, which is a major northeastern skiing center. And so he invited a few other young Austrians, racers and instructors, over to join and kind of build this ski school of his. And one of them was Tony Matt. But Tony Matt is best remembered today for his role in a 1939 ski race, which was called the American Inferno. The American Inferno was kind of a wild race. It was run down the slopes of Mount Washington, which is the highest mountain in New Hampshire and in the Northeast. And the course was 4 miles long. It went from the summit of Mount Washington down the summit cone and then dropped into the glacial cirque that you see at the middle of the picture, which is called Tuckerman Ravine. And then from there down another 2 miles through the woods to the base of the mountain. Now, the race is when Tony Matt joined the race in 1939, it was the third time it had been run. And the existing record time was somewhere in the neighborhood of 13.5 minutes. Tony Matt ran it for the first time and cut that time more than in half to 6.5 minutes, 6 minutes and 29 seconds, something like that, which is pretty incredible if you have seen Mount Washington and if you know what skis looked like in 1939. They were basically just wooden planks and with a cable that wrapped around your heel. And experts who looked at film footage of the race have estimated that Tony Matt hit 90 miles an hour on his descent of the head wall of Tuckerman Ravine. And this was probably partly a function of the fact that he'd never skied there before. And so rather than kind of take a few turns and slow down before going over the head wall, which is what most people did, he just shot right over it and shoosed down and then kind of maintained his speed for the rest of the way. Now, why am I telling this story? When I was a kid, my family, my brothers and I and my father, we did a lot of hiking around Mount Washington or on Mount Washington. And we also did a fair amount of downhill skiing just across the valley on a mountain that had kind of this view of Mount Washington. And so my father loved to tell the story of Tony Matt and this wild descent. And in his telling, Tony Matt tore down the mountain and reached the parking lot at the bottom, where he was greeted with cheers, of course. But he was so shaken up, so terrified of what he'd just done, because he could easily have killed himself, that he basically ignored the crowds, took off his skis and walked them over to his car and then put them down in front of his car or behind his car and drove over them and snapped them in half and then drove off and never skied again. So the story was a memorable one, very dramatic. And it's one that I've heard many times, so it kind of stuck with me. And so when I decided to start writing the story, there was something about Tony Matt's story that resonated with me, and it seemed like it might make an appropriate frame for my own story. And what it was in particular, I think, was this: it kind of seemed to communicate the idea that sometimes it's possible to take our passions a little bit too far. And that's certainly my attitude towards skiing, as I talk about it in this book. It's kind of there's a bit of ambivalence. Now, I started skiing, downhill skiing first when I was 5 years old, and it was about another 5 years before I discovered cross-country skiing. And that happened when I found a pair of old wooden skis in my parents' cellar and dug them out. And it was, like I said, I was about 10 years old at that point, and my feet were nearly as big as my mother's, who has small feet. So I put on the skis and just wandered off into the woods. I grew up in New Hampshire, and it's a place where there's, lots of open forest, and it snows quite a bit. And so pretty soon, cross-country skiing became, for me, just a way of exploring the woods in the wintertime. It wasn't very much different from walking, but it seemed to make more sense than walking when there was snow on the ground. And really, my attitude to skiing hasn't evolved much beyond that. I'm not really one to ski at Nordic centers, though I have sometimes, and it's fun, but mostly it's just sort of a solitary way of going for long walks in the woods. But I need to get this story moving ahead, so we're gonna have to fast forward about 20 years. And when I was in graduate school, I needed to learn to read German pretty quickly. And so I decided to go to Germany for a semester and take an intensive language course. And while I was there, I met the young woman you see on your screen now, whose name is Elena. And she had come to Germany to study German as well, but from Italy. To make a long story short, excuse me, got something in my throat here. To make a long story short, we started dating, fell in love, became a couple. And a couple of years later, I found myself living in Italy, in a small city called Bergamo, uh, which you're looking at now. Bergamo is in northern Italy. It's right at the foot of the Alps. You can see the foothills just rising behind the city. And in many ways, it's a very lovely place. Italy is a lovely country. But for whatever reason, after 7 or 8 years there, I started to feel this creeping sense of unease, and I didn't really know what was causing it. I knew that homesickness was a part of it. I'd been homesick almost, well, almost always in some way since I'd left home, even in college. But it kind of intensified over the years, and it seemed like the less a place was like home, the more I missed it. But what I missed most about home was open space, quiet, um, winter in this case. So all things that were kind of lacking where I was living. But it was more than that. I think it was a sense of not that my life didn't have the kind of shape that I had imagined it would have, say 10 years earlier, which of course is normal. But anyway, it was kind of there was kind of this crisis moment. And it was while I was experiencing this crisis that one day, yeah, just by chance, I picked up, I was passing a newsstand and I saw a copy of National Geographic. And so I grabbed it, as I sometimes do. And when I got home and opened it up, it fell open to this picture, which was a 2-page spread in that month's edition. It was spring of 2011. And before I even knew what what the article was about, it was just that something about the picture just seemed to cry out to me and say, this is what you need to be doing right now. This is the medicine for your this sense of this malaise, I guess. And so I mentioned that I'd grown up cross-country skiing, and it was still something I did as much as I could in the Alps. But I also, for a very long time, had harbored this aspiration of going on some kind of a long, very long, like continental scale, self-propelled journey. I'd always imagined it would be something like, a long canoe trip or a walk on the Appalachian Trail. But suddenly when I saw this picture, I thought, why don't I combine this, my love of cross-country skiing, and, that would kind of deal with the fact that I'm missing winter, like having a good hard winter that was lacking in Italy. I could combine that with this aspiration of this dream of going on some kind of a long journey, so I could go on a long cross-country ski trip. So first it was something I just sort of started fantasizing about fairly vaguely. But as time went on, I got more and more concrete about it in my imaginings. And I pretty soon hit on the idea of Canada as the best place to do this. I happen to be a dual citizen of Canada and the US. My father is Canadian. And then I started to think about, what route would I take? Would I go from west to east or east to west? What kinds of equipment would I take with me? And so on like that for a few months. Now, the problem was that all of this was happening inside my own head. When that winter, I spent a lot more time up in the Alps skiing than I normally did. And all the while, I would be thinking of my ski tours as kind of like training, and asking myself questions about sort of the kinds of systems that I would use on a longer journey. And I also started to do a lot of reading about other people who'd explored on skis. One of the best known of whom was Fridtjof Nansen, who's on your screen now. Fridtjof Nansen was probably the greatest of Norwegian explorers. He's best known for having been the first person to cross the Greenland ice cap. He also tried to reach the North Pole, didn't make it, but got closer than anyone had at the time. And Nansen had been kind of a hero of mine in my early 20s, and I'd read a few biographies at the time. And one of the things I remembered about him was that that he seemed to have a kind of a similar pragmatic approach to cross-country skiing that I had. It wasn't so much about athleticism. It was like just a good way of getting across a winter landscape. And there was a story that I found particularly delightful. When he was a university student, he studied in Bergen on Norway's west coast, but his family was from Oslo in the east. And the two cities are about 300 miles apart, and there's a mountain range in between them. But when the Christmas holidays came around one year, rather than take the train home to Oslo, Nansen one day just kind of, as I remembered it, just sort of without even really planning, just one day clipped his skis on, skied the 300 miles home over the mountains, saw his family, and then, I don't know, probably took the train back. But anyway, I loved that story, and that was kind of, so Nansen became kind of this guiding light for me in some ways. But anyway, as I mentioned a minute ago, this conversation was going on entirely inside my own head. And in the meantime, a couple of years before, I had married Elena, and so I was a married man in Italy. And usually, when one starts to think about embarking on something like this, it's customary to have a discussion with one's wife about it. But I failed to do that. And so one day I mentioned it to her after I'd been thinking about it for about 4 months. And to her, it sounded like I was announcing that this was something that I intended to do. And in retrospect, I have to admit that that's probably the way I did say it. But by that time, I was very attached to the idea. She, on the other hand, thought it was a horrible idea and couldn't sympathize in any way because she doesn't care for the cold. She's not an especially outdoorsy person. But more than that, it was just the fact that I had kind of dropped it on her without having any kind of a preliminary discussion. But I think, I mean, I don't exactly know why in retrospect, but for whatever reason, I was particularly angry about the fact that she just sort of pushed the idea away, and that made me sort of step back from her, and it became, this issue became kind of this, like a self-driving wedge that just pushed us farther and farther apart over the course of the following year. But in spite of Elena's objections, a year later, late fall of 2012, here I was in Vancouver with this huge pile of stuff ready to head north. And at this point, I had all but decided that I wasn't going to go back to Italy. And in some ways, the way that I thought about the journey itself had changed, and it had become, for me, at least in part, a way of putting some distance between me and my wife and sort of ending things once and for all. So this story of a marriage in a kind of downward spiral is quite central to the book. I don't spend as much time on it in the pages of the book as I do on the journey itself, just because I think it would be kind of a boring subject for most people. But it's certainly there, and it's something I return to at the end. But I'm not going to say much about it in the talk, but I will return to it as I tie up the loose ends. So from Vancouver, I took a series of boats north along the coast, first up Vancouver Island, and then up through the Inside Passage, which is the channel that goes up through the islands along the British Columbia coast, and then eventually into Southeast Alaska. So I was headed for a town called Prince Rupert, which is the northernmost Canadian town on the Pacific, just a few miles shy of the Alaska Panhandle. Prince Rupert claims to be the rainiest place on Earth. I'm sure there are other towns on the Northwest coast that make the same claim. But in spite of that, as we came into port, the sky opened up and the sun came out about as much as it does in Prince Rupert. Now, I didn't expect to find snow there. It doesn't, the whole Cascadian coast doesn't really have a very harsh winters. The snow is either up high or inland. So my plan was to put my sled and my skis and a few other snow-related things on a Greyhound bus and have them freighted inland to the next town to the east, which is called Terrace, and it was about 90 miles from Prince Rupert. So I did that, and then I started walking to catch up to my things, and I hoped that in the meantime winter would make an appearance. So it was late. It was November 19th, I think, when I started walking east from Prince Rupert. And sure enough, by the time we got to Terrace, the first snowstorm of the year had moved into town, and it snowed for a couple of days, and about 1.5 feet of snow fell in town, basically, at sea level, but 90 miles inland. And of course, much more than that up in the mountains. So that was good. It meant that I would be able to ski. And from that time on until the end of my journey in mid-March, I would never again see an unsnow-covered landscape. Another thing I realized when I got to Terrace was that I was carrying far more with me, far more equipment than I wanted to be carrying. And so I checked into a motel and spent a couple of days sorting through my kit, getting rid of stuff that I thought I didn't need, either selling it or sending it home. Threw a few things away. And soon I was ready to go. Now, my first skiing objective, was to cross a sub-range of the coast mountains called the Kitimat Range. Now, the coast mountains are just the Canadian extension of what south of the border are called the Cascades. So it goes all the way from Northern California up to the Yukon. And so this area in northern British Columbia is called the Kitimat Range. And I was going to be leaving this town of Terrace and skiing up a valley, the Copper River Valley, climbing up to a pass called Telkwa Pass, and then going down another valley on the opposite side, and eventually 100 miles farther east, coming to a little village really called Telkwa. So when I headed into the mountains, this is somewhere near just outside of Terrace. It was, again, early winter. There's a lot of moisture in the air. It was still pretty warm during the day. I mean, above freezing. You can see in this next picture that I'm not wearing a lot of clothing. For the first 20 miles or so, there was a snowmobile track, which made the going much easier. I didn't have to break trail. It was kind of a mild ascent, but it gradually steepened. And 2 or 3 days into the journey, this was the view back towards the west. At this point, I'd been breaking trail for a couple of days. Kind of slow progress, but steady. Now this next picture here is kind of a parenthesis for anyone in the audience who's not a cross-country skier or a backcountry skier or anything like that. A lot of people don't realize that it's possible to ski uphill. We're used to seeing downhill skiers or people skiing on prepared tracks, but you can actually ski up pretty steep slopes, and it's thanks to what are called climbing skins. In this picture, I'm showing my climbing skin. So climbing skins are basically these pieces of fabric that adhere to the bases of your skis, and the fabric has a diagonally backward oriented nap to it. And so what that does is it enables you to slide forward, but if there's any backward or downward pressure put on the ski, it kind of bites into the snow and keeps you from sliding back. And I had 2 types of climbing skins. I had these shorter half skins that would give enough traction to pull my sled and go up slight inclines, and then had full length ones that went from the tip to the tail of the skis, and with those you can go up surprisingly steep slopes. And with help from my climbing skins, pretty soon, another couple of days, I was up in mountains that looked like these. So what you have to imagine as I'm approaching the pass is there's kind of a row of mountains to my south, like this, and then a mirror image of these mountains to my north, and the valley's kind of climbing up higher and higher and getting narrower and narrower as I go up. And soon it was so narrow at the bottom, and kind of there was a creek flowing down. It was kind of choked out with alders, and so I'd be forced up onto these talus slopes that came down like these sort of banking down from the mountains. And some of it was a bit sketchy because they were pretty steep and there was a fair amount of snow. And of course, what that means is that there's risk of avalanche, which wasn't something, I mean, it was something that I had thought a little bit about, but it wasn't a serious concern of mine, but it started to become one at this point. And it was just as I started worrying about avalanches that suddenly, about 600 or 700 yards in front of me, I heard this boom. And then suddenly the side of this mountain in front of me was sliding down, and powder snow was billowing hundreds of feet into the air. And of course, it stopped me in my tracks. I decided I would dig my camera out. It took a couple of minutes, but even a couple of minutes later, you can still see that the snow hasn't settled back to the ground. And so this was really the first, it was kind of a wake-up call, that this wasn't exactly a walk in the park, and that maybe it was the first time I really doubted the wisdom of what I was doing. And it was particularly scary because this was shortly before dark. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but it was very close to dark, and I knew that there was an open river crossing somewhere up not far ahead, and I didn't feel like taking that on so late in the day. And so I knew that I was going to have to sleep somewhere near the foot of this bank. You can see a white expanse, flat expanse to the left, but that was a lake. And again, it was early in the winter, so I wasn't sure how stable the ice was, and I didn't want to, try and go out and sleep on the lake. And so I ended up having to sleep very close to the bank, and needless to say, it was not a very good night's sleep. But I made it through the night. And the next day was a very slow day, hard climbing. It rained, and the snow was deep, and so I made about 2 miles of progress. And then the third day after this, I finally reached the pass and got through it and was pretty ecstatic about it. And at this point, I want to just stop for a minute and read a little passage about the moments after getting through the pass. I take a sip of water first. Reversals come swiftly in the winter wilds. For the first few minutes east of the pass, I was ecstatic. The sun came out as if to announce that I was beyond the reach of the gray Pacific. The snow was deeper now and waved out in oceanic drifts, some at least 12 feet deep. I took a new series of sled turnovers in my stride and thought only on the bright side, cheerfully switching out my short climbing skins again when I found that the longer ones were the only way I had any purchase in the thigh-deep fluff. But as the sun sank below the high ridge at my back, I came to the edge of a brook set down in a gully. It was not good for my spirits. Unloading and reloading the tightly packed sled was tedious, cold, and never welcome work. Getting across the deep trench with a few feet of fast water flowing down its middle posed a concrete challenge. I poked around and discovered where a tree had fallen without being uprooted, so that it hung slantwise halfway across the gap. If I could climb far enough up it, I could manage to jump to the other bank. First, I took small loads of gear up the trunk and tossed them to the far side, where they landed in the soft snow. Then I made the leap. On the other side, however, I found that the trail was gone. I stood face to face with a wall of dense wood. Discouragement washed over me, drowning the high feeling of a few minutes before. But I knew there had to be a trail somewhere on this side of the brook. I'd seen proof only moments before that a trail this far from the world doesn't just run out, it leads somewhere. Out of the food box, I grabbed a snack for energy and to lift my mood, and then abandoned my sled again to explore on my skis what lay ahead. It wasn't heartening. I squeezed into a thick tangle of alder and hemlock. The maturing hemlock trees, some as thick as my arm, said that someone had been this way, but perhaps not in decades. Hemlocks grow slowly, especially here at the extreme eastern limit of their range, which is seldom more than 60 miles inland. The snow was still deep and lay in monstrous drifts riddled with small tree wells. I wove my way through, and after half an hour broke out on the other side, where something like a trail reappeared. I felt mild comfort to see a faded piece of flagging tape on a branch. I now realized I would have to bring my sled through this maze. The thought reduced me to tears on the spot. It seemed stupid to waste energy trying to fight the tears, and so I decided to start skiing back and let myself keep crying. Schlepping along in regular steps, I became conscious of the rhythm of my breathing. Then I slowed it down and steadied it, bringing it into time with my feet, and this eventually brought the tears under control too. I skied half an hour back to the stream, loaded half my gear onto a sled. A full load was too bulky to slither through the narrow gaps between trees, and started through. With half a load, The sled performed miracles, snaking along behind me like a bobsled, skimming over drifts. Ecstasy came back, and soon I was shouting maniacally. I professed my undying admiration for the man who designed and built my sled in a far-off Minnesota garage, recompense for the flood of curses I'd called upon his unknowing head over the preceding days. When I came to a point where I could find no gap between the trees wide enough to pass through, I teetered on the verge of another breakdown, but my better half won out, and I took out my hatchet and felled a thick tree. The adrenaline blitzing through my system made it like slicing through butter. I'll stop there. I think it's a good place. So eventually I made it down from the pass to a little village called Telqua. And when I got there, I met this lovely couple whose names were Nick and Mika. And it was kind of an important moment, and it became almost like a kind of pattern. By the time I'd left, in some ways the disagreement, to put it mildly, between me and my wife had kind of I don't know, it had kind of soured me against my surroundings and other human beings, and in the journey had in some way become sort of a flight from people, and I'd become kind of a hermit, kind of a misanthrope in some ways. And so meeting this couple, Nick and Mika, I just met them when I came down to the village quite by chance, and they invited me to spend the night in their home and dry my things off and have dinner with them. And we ended up staying in touch and becoming friends. But this was just one of many chance encounters with generous human beings along the way. And I've peppered the book with stories of these encounters because I think that they're they're important. Because it was almost as if the sort of wider community of human beings was sort of extending a hand, kind of roping me back into this collective that I was somehow trying to flee from. And so there are lots of stories like that in the book. This picture here, not a very interesting picture, but it's here just to show my sleeping bag. Some people who are come to hear about my book are winter camping enthusiasts, and so they're curious about my sleeping bag. It was made by this little company, which by chance really was based in New Hampshire. It's now defunct, sadly, but it was basically this guy who just made sleeping bags in his house and sold them, and they were kind of a cult item almost among polar explorers and high altitude explorers. And I could go on for a very long time about the sleeping bag, but two of the features I'll mention and then move on are the fact that it had a twin top. So there are two tops on the bag rather than just the customary one. And they had two different thicknesses, and they could be used either together or separately. So you had three possibilities to get three different levels of warmth. And then another thing about it was it had a zip that went all the way around. Usually you just have a zip on one side. Sleeping bags can be quite uncomfortable as a result. But with the zip all the way around, you can ventilate the sleeping bag in all kinds of ways, which is very important for winter camping because it enables you to regulate your heat and keep condensation to a minimum. And what that means over the course of many nights outside is that you can keep the ice in your tent and in your sleeping bag to a minimum. What this map shows is the route that I actually skied. So when I had first hatched the idea of going on this journey, I thought that it would be possible to ski all the way across Canada in a single winter. But I realized after about 3 weeks on the trail that at the rate I was going, at least, that was not going to happen. And so this is the route I actually skied, and it basically corresponds to the first half or so of my original plan. There were a few minor tweaks I had to make, and the idea here was basically to straddle the 55th parallel which to me represented kind of the heart of the boreal forest. The boreal forest is that evergreen ecosystem that we think of when we think of Canada or Scandinavia. And it was in the boreal forest that skiing originally evolved in Scandinavia. And so there was I liked this idea of pairing skis with the kind of ecosystem they were meant to be used in. And so when I realized that I wasn't going to make it all the way across Canada, my focus kind of shifted to the idea of skiing across a season, making it until the end of winter. Now, here we're looking at a logging road in northern British Columbia. There are thousands of miles of logging roads. Most of them are much smaller than this. This is kind of a major artery, probably leading to a logging camp or something. There's a power line you can see in 2 lanes, but usually they're just 1 lane, unimproved gravel roads. And logging roads in British Columbia, especially, were important for me as trails, essentially. So most logging roads are not maintained in the winter. They're not plowed or graded unless they're in an area where timber is actively being harvested in a given winter. So that means that most of them just lie under a few feet of snow, and they become, a perfect way of traveling long distances through wild places. And so I used a lot of logging roads in British Columbia. That was in addition to trails. I used ordinary trails a lot of the time. And then in Alberta, I occasionally found myself, well, more than occasionally, I probably skied a couple of 100 miles along the railroad in Alberta, which sounds strange, but maybe less so to people in Montana. But in the East, people are sort of perplexed by this because they think of Amtrak or commuter rails going to Boston or New York. But in northwestern Canada, northern Canada in general, the railroads, exist in places where there are no automobile roads. They're basically just the most direct line from point A to point B for moving cargo. And if that means going across the middle of the wilderness, then that's where the train goes. Now in this picture, I was coming into a rail yard in a town in northeastern British Columbia, but usually it was something more like this, just this line cut through the forest and nothing for, many, many miles on either side. And trains would come by once a day at the most, sometimes not for 2 or 3 days at a time. And then of course, if it snowed between the passing of 2 trains, then the tracks themselves would disappear. And then once I got into Saskatchewan and Alberta, I started to ski on frozen lakes a lot. I could kind of link them together, lake after lake after lake. And snowmobile trails, particularly in Manitoba, there's an extensive network of very long distance snowmobile trails, and I was able to rely on them. So my point is that my route across this space was kind of a patchwork. And that meant that I had to do a lot of thinking about, well, concrete kind of thinking about how I was moving across the landscape, but that sometimes led me to think more poetically or philosophically, you might say, about the way that other animals move across winter landscapes. And that was kind of the spirit of this little picture of a mousetrack. There was just something that I almost envied about the elegance of the line the mouse made across the snow. And what I really love about this picture is how you can see this, where its tail is dragged behind its feet. Here we're looking at the Peace River. And the Peace River is a pretty famous river in the north, and it was the most important river I skied across, and it was kind of an exciting moment for me because the Peace flows north, and then eventually via the Slave and Mackenzie rivers, it reaches the Arctic Ocean. And so this skiing, I crossed the Peace River on a railroad trestle, and even though it was in a very cold place, this is probably the northernmost point of my journey. But there was a dam just upstream on the Peace River, and so the water was constantly being modulated, the water level, and so it still flowed even though it had been like 45 below just a couple of days before I crossed the Peace River. And so anyway, it gave me kind of a thrill to be skiing over Arctic bound water. Here we are in Alberta now. Alberta was interesting. It was different from the other provinces I skied across in many ways. And one of the ways it was different was that I occasionally found myself having to ski down out of the boreal forest that I mentioned earlier and onto sections of prairie for a few days here and there. It was January, so it was the coldest part of the winter. And what it meant coming out onto the prairie meant was that I was exposed to the wind in a way that I hadn't been in the woods. And so really some of my coldest moments of the winter were spent here in Alberta. Here crossing a road, you can see this kind of serrated wind pattern. Maybe this is probably more familiar to you in Montana, where you have more open space than we do in New Hampshire. What I like about this picture, also taken in Alberta, is the atmosphere. Really, often there was this sort of this pink pastel infused light. There were the long morning and afternoon twilights, and so it often looked like this kind of half light, which was very pretty. A grain elevator. I didn't expect to see grain elevators as far north as I was, but again, I was on the prairie. So what we're looking at here is Lesser Slave Lake. Lesser Slave Lake is in north central Alberta, and it was the first of three really big lakes that I skied across. I skied across lots of smaller lakes, but this was the first big one. And so it was kind of an important moment. And I think I want to stop here just to do it, read another little passage, since we are talking about the coldest part of the winter. And so there are a couple of parts of the book where I sort of step out of the narrative of the journey itself and talk about themes that are in some way important. And one of those themes is winter. So I just want to read the first few paragraphs of a chapter called Winter. Like northern towns whose very existence I sometimes doubt, winter is hard to imagine in summertime. When birds peep and the air pulses with cicada song and plump leaves flutter on the breeze, it takes no special awareness to see that the earth is alive and even to recognize benevolence in it. The thought of ice only brings refreshment. It's an accent on the day, like a dash of pepper on your picnic lunch. The ice cubes in the cooler are delicate things to be carefully kept from melting. It takes intense mental effort to turn the world on which your very sense of being depends inside out, so that those glistening little cubes that under the sun look almost like jewels become the dominant element, invading everything else, silencing the music of summer and freezing the trees into leafless submission. Your own being will be profoundly anxious until you find some way of making heat, which your vigilance will then turn to guarding jealously. The friendly summer world has now become impossibly distant. The purpose of winter is to reveal weaknesses in living things. Such weaknesses are identified by a restriction of the solar energy that is fed into an ecosystem, which puts everything in it under stress. Diminished sunlight and the resulting cold are the generic stressors, but more specific phenomena test individual members of an ecosystem: starvation, heavy snow loads, blowing ice particles, dehydration, and ice formation that can kill in several ways. Once weaknesses are identified, inefficiencies can be purged and excess pared away in a process of consolidating the gains of the preceding summer, so that the seasons can be seen working together to maintain strength. Living beings that can't make do with a restricted energy input are killed without fanfare. When on clear, cold days you are skiing across a vast expanse of white emptiness, and the air seems perfectly still, and you almost imagine there is nothing alive on earth except for you, you can sometimes hear wind currents tangling in the upper air. They moan or make soft howling noises, and in so desolate a place, they seem to cry out to have meanings attached to them. But these writhing drafts have no meaning. The rest that one poet finds in silently falling snow is for another winter muffling its victim's screams with a pillow. Still, there's an irony detectable in winter that enables me to see it as something more than a single-minded eugenicist. Snow keeps things warm, for instance, by reflecting the sun's warmth, which threatens to melt it. As the snowpack ages, water molecules migrate vertically in a process called constructive metamorphism, which provides protection from cold and predation for small creatures beneath it, but at the same time renders the surface sometimes dangerously unstable to large animals above. Winter's ironies multiply every time I go out skiing and look around. We think of winter as a time of restriction, but what of all the coyotes I saw one afternoon last winter as I skied out onto a lake near my home? There were 7 of them. I do not see 7 coyotes in 7 years in other seasons. Here, ice doubles the size of the world for some land animals. Winter expands the range, and the wild canids come out of hiding. But where the coyotes and wolves and foxes win confidence from the opening up of the land, the temptation to occupy the void heightens vulnerability for others. Prey animals are the most obviously vulnerable, but ice has its own dangers, and its hidden weak spots can do in even the strongest predator. Death comes in ways you might not at first expect to. 2 winters ago, on an exposed stretch of snowless ice, I saw a frozen doe, as yet unscavenged. It seemed her hooves could get no purchase on the slippery surface, and she was immobilized beyond redeeming. I'll stop there. Kind of a dark place to stop. I'm sorry about that. But we should move along. So this is what my camp looked like any given evening, different settings, of course, but I used a tunnel-shaped tent, which tends to be more wind resistant than some other shapes. And the tent was divided into 2 compartments. So I slept in the part that's farther away from us in this picture. And the nearer part, which is called the vestibule, is where I stored anything that needed to be kept under a roof. And it's where I did my cooking every evening. And after I cooked, which is a relatively quick process, I had to keep my stove running and just shovel scoop after scoop of snow into the cook pot and melt the snow into liquid water, and then heat it up and pour it into my thermos, and that would become my water for the 24 hours to come. And it was while I was waiting for the snow to melt every evening for a couple of hours that I would scribble in my journal and make a pretty detailed account of the day's events. And that, of course, became very useful to me when I eventually sat down to write a book. Now here we're at this point, we're in Saskatchewan. It's February, the days are getting noticeably longer. And it was still cold, but very sunny, and the snow had this lovely sparkle to it. And it was here in Western Saskatchewan that had this really wonderful string of days of just perfect skiing, long but thoroughly enjoyable days of skiing. And they all just started to sort of blend together. And it was some of the best skiing I've ever done. My skis were made by this little Norwegian company called Osnes, and all their models are named after various Norwegian explorers. And so mine were named after Roald Amundsen, who was the first person to reach the South Pole. And so there was this picture of him emblazoned near the tips of the skis. And he had this very stern kind of look on his face. And so whenever I felt, discouraged or tired or what have you, it was enough to just look down at Roald, make eye contact, and that would give me the kick in the pants that I needed, the motivation to keep moving. Here we're looking at the home of a character in the book whose name was Don Skopik. And I call him the Cossack in the book. That's what his friends called him. And he's sort of this crusty northern character. And I think I want to squeeze in just a little reading actually about him, because it's one of my favorite characters in the book. So I met him. I was just leaving this little town in northern Saskatchewan called Beauval, which is the heart of a Cree Nation, First Nations reserve. And like I was leaving town and skiing fairly close to the side of a road. And this guy just stopped. Well, when I first saw him, he was standing there by the side of the road next to his car, staring at me. It was a black sedan, and the driver appeared to be waiting for me. When I came closer, he got out and stood watching my approach. He wore a leather jacket and was smoking a cigarette. I skied up to him, even though he looked like he might be a creep. He shook his head slowly and smiled when our eyes met. "I know exactly what you're up to," he said confidently. "I saw you from the road and I knew it. This guy's in it for the long haul," I said. "I've done a lot of this sort of thing myself." I was skeptical, standing there by the side of the road in his jeans with a cigarette in hand. He hardly looked the part. "I used to mush dogs all through this country," he said. "Come on, let's load your stuff into the car. We'll go back to my place, pull out some maps. You can regroup and I'll put you together, and I'll help put you together a route." His directness was somehow captivating, and my instinct said he was probably harmless. I didn't hesitate in stuffing my gear into the back of his car, and off we drove, with the creaky trunk hatch flopping at each bump in the road. We drove 4 miles back west to Don Skopic's cabin, which he and his sons had built from 90 pine logs they felled nearby. The cabin had electric lights, but was otherwise primitive. Don lived alone, and you could tell. His house rules demanded strict parsimony, which he called cheapness. "The toilet's in here," he said, showing me the bathroom. "But if you just have to take a leak, don't flush it. Or better yet, go outside. And if you do have to flush, just pour the water from here into the toilet." He indicated a 5-gallon bucket under the sink drain. "And make sure you remember to put the bucket back under the sink, because I disconnected the drain pipe. Also, if you decide you need to shower, which you don't, take the bucket with you and try to catch as much water as you can." The kitchen consisted of a wood stove, a few pots and pans and utensils hung on the wall behind it. Don kept a supply of dry firewood inside the house. He rationed it carefully and was forever studying ways to burn less while keeping the house tolerably warm. He asked me if I knew any tricks. The floors were littered with books and photographs and contraptions for exercising. There was a large flat-screen TV that had never been hooked up, and everywhere were boxes of rare coins that supplemented Don's pension as a retired high school teacher. Near the boxes were scribbled lists of customer orders and addresses all over Canada and the United States. Don had grown up in Prince Albert, 190 miles southeast of Beauval. As a teenager, exploring the wilderness north of his home and gazing wistfully at maps of the lakes that dot Saskatchewan's north by the thousands, it became his ambition to, quote, "know the trails of the north better than any other white man." He moved north and married a native woman from Beauval who bore him 2 sons, but the marriage didn't last. He had a working grasp of Dene and Cree and had spent years exploring the north by dog sled, canoe, and bush plane. Over the last 10 years, however, Don had spent little time in the wild. He'd taken to spending several months a year traveling in Europe, mostly in Ukraine and Russia, where his forebears came from. He signed his correspondence the Cossack and could speak Russian. When he saw me skiing along the side of the road at the edge of the bush, it had reawakened something in him. He seemed to want to connect again to a world he'd once been immersed in. Don was excited as he climbed up to his sleeping loft and, after digging through a few layers of cumulus, pulled out a 4-foot-long cardboard box. He threw it down to me and descended to the ladder. The box was open at one end and was stuffed full of crumpled pieces of old paper. We stood in front of the stove and Don began pulling out balls of paper and tossing them on the floor. Not this either," he said, discarding sheet after sheet. They were topographical maps, 10s of them. To the untrained eye, they would have all looked the same. Each one covered a couple of 100 square miles of townless, lake-strewn granite earth. But before even seeing the names on each map, Don could understand almost instantly what it showed. He eventually found the maps he wanted, got down on his knees and flattened them out on the floor. His eyes lit up and his voice brightened as his fingers ran over them, skimming easily from lake to lake. The maps were old and yellowed, but the basic shape of the land would be the same. With a pencil, he marked the locations of cabins. He told me the local names of bodies of water, which differed sometimes from the names used by map makers, and gave explanations of Cree place names. I'll stop there. And so from there, I headed on to a chain of lakes to carry me basically the rest of the way east across Saskatchewan. So these next few pictures are taken on a few lakes that are part of the Churchill River system. And then eventually this one is Lac La Ronge, which is the biggest lake that I skied across over the course of the winter. And it's one of the largest lakes in Saskatchewan. Where I crossed it, it was between 30 and 40 miles wide. And so this picture is here really to give you a sense of scale. The black line on the horizon is an island, not the mainland. And then here, so in getting across the lake, I had to spend 2 nights camped out on the ice. And this is one of those 2 nights. And as you can see, there's no land on the horizon. So it was basically a matter of skiing towards the sun for the first half of the day, because I was heading east, and then the second half of the day skiing away from the sun. And that way, basically, I was able to keep roughly oriented. And here, finally, I am in Manitoba. This picture was taken by a newspaper reporter along the way, and I was just leaving a little town called Flin Flon in northern Manitoba, which is a mining town. There's one of the biggest copper mines in the world, I think, there. And so what you see is the smelter behind me. And here, from the same series of pictures, skiing south and into Manitoba, where I spent the last couple of weeks of the winter. And that pretty much winds things down as far as pictures go. But there are a couple of things I want to say just to tie up the loose ends. So I mentioned that when I set out, I was pretty much sure that I wasn't going to be going back to Italy and to my marriage, and things kind of continued to spiral downhill over the course of the winter. And there's lots of frankly embarrassing detail about this in the book, but I tried to write an honest book to talk openly about my mistakes, of which I made many. But anyway, to make another long story short, events happened in a way that were very surprising to me, and eventually, after several years after the end of this journey, my wife and I eventually managed to patch things up and to get back together. So the story is told using this wider time frame, and that's one of the reasons it took me a few years to write the book, because before that happened, I didn't really know. It seemed like the journey in some way had been a waste of my time. So I guess my point is that the book has a happy ending. It's kind of a spoiler, but sometimes it's nice to read a true story that has a happy ending. And so here's the visual aid to go with that. My wife and I reunited. And then the other thing connects back to the image I opened with of Tony Matt, the Austrian ski racer. So I mentioned that my father used to tell me and my brothers that story when we were kids, of him tearing down Mount Washington and then running over his skis and never skiing again. And so I remembered that story and wanted to use it in my book, but I thought, well, I'd better make sure I have all the details straight. And so I read a few accounts of the American Inferno and didn't find anything about Tony Matt running over his skis. So I eventually wrote to a ski historian at the New England Ski Museum in New Hampshire and asked him, whether he'd ever heard anything about that. He said, no, the race happened and Tony Matt won it and broke the record and so forth. But I'm certain that he didn't run over his skis and stop skiing. He went on to have a long and illustrious skiing career. And so basically the fact was my dad had just invented an ending to the story that I apparently thought was more interesting. But it contained, even though it was totally made up, it contained kind of a kernel of truth, at least I thought it did. And so I decided, in spite of the fact that it isn't a true story, that I thought that was a story worth retelling in my father's version.